Hey guys, so we're busy editing part 2 of our latest series, Overlooked, Lost in the Shining Hotel. But I wanted to take a second to acknowledge something. And I don't even know who exactly I'm acknowledging this to. I just think acknowledging it might be helpful for people to kind of put words to a feeling they can't quite seem to shake or even place about everything that just happened. I mean, it sounds really simple, but sometimes just recognize the action of just recognizing something for what it is and acknowledging that can be a very healing thing. It can be very helpful in moving forward. I've been learning more and more on the importance of words because, sometimes words have two meanings.
No stairway. Denied.
Actually, a lot of words have several meanings. And knowing all of these meanings can change the nature of what's being communicated, depending on which definition the person speaking intends for what is being said. I just think it's interesting to note that the intention is based upon the speaker. It's not based upon the audience's assumptions, although I think in this world, a lot of times people are communicating things and they're banking on those assumptions. I don't think many people realize that's how intention actually works with that. So I've been spending a lot of time with our 1894 dictionary, which is really an amazing book, I think. There's so much more information there than the modern printed dictionaries half its size. Lots more context, which is very, very important. Context is one of the most important things to understanding where we are, how we got here, where we're going. Very important. Did you know, for example, that the first definition listed under person isn't human being? I didn't realize this until recently. Person comes from the Latin persona, or mask. The number one definition before all others listed in my dictionary says that a person is a character or part, as in a play, a specific kind of manifestation of individual character, whether in real life or in literary or dramatic representation, an assumed character. And it's only after that does it include definitions about members of humankind, which approaches something closer to the definition of a human being. But the first definition of person is a character, a persona. Not the same exact thing. It's not the same thing. It can be, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always is. Someone posted something that really tickled my brain, and I couldn't let go of it. They said, things aren't getting worse. The veil over society is being removed. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like that. That's the substance of it. And I've been turning that over in my mind for a while now. How many of you are familiar with the Stanford prison experiment? I know we've mentioned it in videos in the past, but I don't think we've done a full video on it. But back in 1971, Stanford psychology professor Philip Zimbardo and his research team selected 24 men who were mostly students and paid them $15 a day to be either prisoners or prison guards, so their behavior could be studied in a simulated prison environment. So it was 24 people, 12 of each. The guards were given khaki uniforms and sunglasses to hide behind, and they were told it was their job to keep the prisoners from escaping. And the whole setup was extremely realistic. From what I've read, it was taken pretty far. For example, on the morning of the experiment, real Palo Alto police were used to arrest the prisoners at their homes, the people who were going to be prisoners in the experiment. They went and arrested them with police cars and sirens and the whole nine, with TV cameras in tow that were filming it for the nightly news, so it was like a real thing. And these people were booked into a real jail. They were stripped down. They were given a smock with an ID number on it. Then they were blindfolded and taken to a makeshift prison set up in the basement of a hall on the college campus. And the guy running the experiment, Zimbardo, told the Toronto Symposium in the summer of 1996 that he'd been conducting research for some years on de-individuation, which I had to look up to make sure I knew what that meant, because it doesn't just mean stripping an individual of his identity or her identity, but it's when an individual loses himself to a herd mentality. So it's a loss of self-awareness to the group or in a group when you're in a group. It's a little more than just losing your individuality. So it's losing yourself to a herd mentality. And he was also studying dehumanization, which he says illustrated the ease with which ordinary people could be led to engage in antisocial acts by putting them in situations where they felt anonymous or where they could perceive of others as less than human, as enemies or as objects.
The stress reaction was so extreme that normal kids we picked because they're healthy had breakdowns within 36 hours. The study ended after 6 days because was out of control. 5 kids had emotional breakdowns.
The study was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it had to be shut down after only 6 days because the dozen people who were given a costume and a little bit of power became increasingly authoritarian and ultimately described as brutal in the way they treated the other 12 people who were pretending to be prisoners. There was one guard the prisoners considered particularly sadistic, and they nicknamed him John Wayne. And apparently when he would come in to assume his post, he would start walking differently and speaking in a southern accent. But only when he was a guard. Psychology professor Christina Maslach, who's actually the one that blew the whistle on "we need to stop this, it's gone too far," she had come in the day before they quit, on the 5th day, to do prisoner interviews and talk to this man while he was waiting to start his guard shift. And she described him as charming, funny, and smart. But then witnessed his complete transformation after he assumed his guard role. And she said it was like Jekyll and Hyde. It really took my breath away. And that's over a 5-day period. He didn't start out doing that, but he essentially gave himself this persona as part of his role over time and just started really leaning into being this character that he gave himself that role. And I want to note the men selected for this study came from a pool of 70 individuals. So they gave them all a battery of psychological tests and all that beforehand, and they claimed they chose the ones deemed most, quote, normal and healthy to participate in this. And it should also be noted the experiment itself was dependent largely on the behavior of the guards, not the prisoners. A former guard in the experiment has since claimed that guards were led to believe that they themselves were not the point of the experiment. So in other words, the guards were purposefully misled to believe they had free rein to behave however they thought they should under these circumstances. And they were told that their behavior was essentially for the greater good. They were given the idea they were the good guys. They're the guards. The Stanford prison experiment has since been deemed flawed for a number of reasons, and its conclusions are still a point of controversy to this day. But there's a few things that stand out about what went down there. You have one group, the prisoners, that have been dehumanized. They're stripped of their individual identities and they're put into a group that's basically labeled as bad people. I mean, they're prisoners, right? They're going to jail for a reason. They've obviously committed a crime of some kind to get there. And so they're like the bad guys, right? And then you have these other people who were given a costume of authority and told they had this authority. And they kind of have this group identity going of good guy, acting in ways they perceive to be sanctioned as okay by the majority of society due to the power dynamic of perceived authority combined with the dehumanization of the so-called prisoners, right? Because the guards are good guys and the prisoners are bad guys. And I know it isn't that black and white, but that's basically the dynamic that's being worked under here. And I feel personally like whether some people want to see it or not, let alone admit it or not, this is something that many of us witnessed and experienced over the last 2 years in this society, right? There were people who reacted to this situation by standing with their individual principles in the face of the unknown, in the face of fear, in the face of everything that was happening. Principles like my body, my choice, for example, being a standard of freedom for everyone, right? I'm not going to force you to do something that you do not want to do with your own body because it's not my body and it's not my choice to make that choice for you, that kind of thing. Bodily autonomy being a very important thing. Right? And then there were other people who, whether it was because of fear or latent authoritarian leanings or whatever, right? What they were being told on TV, it doesn't matter. Whatever the reason was, there were other people who suddenly felt sanctioned by being in a majority who would apparently excuse away almost anything against the minority that they were told were essentially the bad guys, the dangerous bad guys, if that majority was assured by the system that this was for the greater good.
A conclusion you could make from the Stanford Prison experiment is that when you tell people to be cruel, they'll do it. If you tell them it's for a greater good, like science, right. Who would have thought?
And people began to play roles in there with that. I remember when major streaming channels like Amazon Prime began to promote pandemic movies. All of a sudden, 2011's Contagion made a huge comeback and became super popular. It was in the #1 trending all of a sudden. And it's almost like some people rewatched those movies because it wasn't a new movie. I mean, it was out for, 10 years or whatever. But they watched it because of what was going on. And then they began acting accordingly as if they had cast themselves in that movie, but as a character in the film, but in real life.
Some men operate the big television cameras. Others control the pictures as they go out over the air. They see to it that Richard gets the right program at the right time.
So, despite the fact that that film is a fictional Hollywood creation that, I don't know, I watched half of it. I thought it was extremely propagandistic. I really couldn't get through it because it was just too ridiculous, and I didn't even watch the whole thing. But
he often watches television at home. The programs are fun, and sometimes he learns a great deal from them.
It's a movie. It's not real life. But people were watching it and then acting like that's what everything is. It's that movie or something similar, right? And it goes back to what that person was saying about the veil. Because what happened in the last couple years wasn't a movie, though. Something happened, and it felt like a movie at times, but it wasn't, though. It was a peek, I think, a peek behind the veil of society, which is a veil made up of persons who were both literally and figuratively wearing many masks. And the media and major institutions were really pushing a narrative that alchemically divided people. They were separated in a way that it got to a point where people on this side couldn't even see where people on this side were coming from. It's almost as if they were in the multiverse. They were in two different universes, and those universes did not coincide. Like, you would be out in public and certain people would be acting in ways you could almost tell which types of mainstream media were being watched by people based on how they were acting in public, right? What level of information they had received that was making them act in certain ways, like between everything's normal to it's the apocalypse, and you could really tell who was watching which brand of information there. You could see it, right? And I mean, I didn't go up and start asking people, but I'm willing to bet if I had, I would have been right probably 99% of the time because it was that obvious and clear cut. And it really started to separate people into these groups, and the groups became people who were doing what they were told without any question at all, and people who were asking questions and were not just doing what they were told without asking those questions. And the separation between those two groups became more and more hardcore over time, to the point that society slowly turned into something kind of resembling a Stanford prison experiment. Because the people who felt they were in the right, that they were the majority, that they were sanctioned to behave in certain ways because it was for the greater good or whatever, I have been yelled at by some of those people. I have seen them yell at other people. I have seen them do things that don't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense.
It doesn't make sense. And he totally barked at us, some young 20-something kid, like it's Clockwork Orange. On the side of the line! That's the first thing that pops into my mind anyway.
Because they thought that they had the authority to somehow, even though it wasn't a law. Nothing was a law. This was not like you're now a deputized police officer of the law and you are enforcing laws. That was not what was happening.
Point is, it's just totally arbitrary. They didn't do any of those things last time I was at the grocery store.
The entire time that supposedly this curve was being flattened, none of these rules were in place, and it did what exactly to change it?
These were average people who had just been told a whole lot of stuff and started trying to mandate it on everyone else.
But it's been transformed into a social obedience experiment where it's not even like police or something or medical authorities telling you what to do. We're all supposed to learn to tell each other what to do. And young, barely 20 store employees are getting all bitchy and, barking things for you to do. Excuse me.
Getting up in people's faces, screaming, all kinds of behavior, okay? That is not rational. It's not their place to do, okay? But they had this perception of authority, once again. It's a very, very Stanford prison experiment, I feel.
I don't have to do that. And the guy literally says, rules are rules.
Rules are rules. So whatever they make up.
Rules are arbitrary.
Asinine thing.
I didn't agree to those rules.
And when I realized that this was the kind of thing that was going on, I stopped going into places where I was going to have to put up with that. I avoided that as much as possible because there was no way I was going to play into that environment. Not at all, okay? I recognized it for what it was very, very early on and went, yeah, I'm going to minimize my participation in whatever this is.
Rules are rules. So whatever arbitrary made-up bullshit they decide to do this week, that's the rules, man. This week we're all going to dress in full-body condoms and jump up and down the entire time.
It's coming. You know it's coming.
Right. This is messed up, and it's not okay. And you can't argue with those people in that position. It's like they're in a different universe from you. So you can talk logic all day. You can talk rational points all day. It is not going to matter. Because they have fully given themselves over to the role that they are now playing. And whatever you had to say is irrelevant. It'd be like if the person thinks they're in Kansas, and you're like, we're not in Kansas anymore. Here's exactly where we are. Here's a sign that says we're in Oklahoma. Here's a map of Oklahoma. Here's pictures of, it's not going to matter. If they think they're in Kansas, to them they're in Kansas. They're not going to hear you say we're not in Kansas anymore. They're not going to be able to see that, no matter what you say. If they don't want to see it, if they're not open-minded to seeing it, they're not going to see it, right? But people began acting in tyrannical ways. I could tell you stories for days of things that happened to people I know. It got pretty bad, right? Friends were lost. Family members were also people. There are people who are related that are no longer talking to each other. There was a woman my mom worked with who she considered a friend, who said anyone who didn't do as they were told for the greater good should just go off into the woods and die. That's a statement she made. I mean, you could see the contradiction just within that statement, right? It's weird to justify basically a genocidal opinion in the same sentence where you profess to care about what's good for everyone. Right? Doesn't really make a lot of sense at all. And then there's the blind trust in and obedience to authority, which enabled and justified pretty much anything under the guise of, well, it's an emergency, so just anything goes, anything.
And, the problem, every time I don't comply with something, it's happened over the years. There's been all these things. The thing that always bothers me is the person doesn't respond by saying, like, oh, it's another one of you. Yeah, lots of people don't agree with this. Instead, they have this stunned face, like, you questioned?
How did you question the rules? What's wrong with you?
And it's obvious from their face it's the first time they've ever had anyone challenge a rule.
A rule?
These are not laws. They're not even policies. They're rules.
And they're completely
Which came
made up
from
every
where?
5 minutes. Exactly.
Apparently including bodily autonomy. And there are people who stood up for theirs, and for whatever their reason was for doing so, who paid in some cases very high prices for that. Not just being ostracized socially, but having businesses ruined, getting fired, all kinds of stuff. There are lawsuits happening now, and some people are being forced to be hired back because what was done to them wasn't legal. So that's a thing now. Because what they had to go through was not legal. It wasn't okay to fire them for not doing X or Y or Z. Just because you said it's an emergency, abundance of caution, blah, blah, blah. And many of us know much worse was said and done as time went on. Like I said, I could go on all day. But the most insane stuff seemed to come from those living with the most fear. But again, these are also people who were bolstered by media-driven perceptions of being the good guys in the majority. And I wonder, would they have acted that way if it wasn't that perception? I don't know. Which also kind of illustrates with horrible simplicity the power of the mainstream media over crafting some people's reality for them. I mean, some people utterly failed to notice that what was actually happening in the streets did not match what was being described on a TV screen. It just didn't match. And some people didn't see it. Some people were told something on a screen, and that was it for them. It didn't matter if they went out in the street and nothing was like what they were shown on the screen. They acted accordingly because they were told to, and it was no questions asked. Which leaves you to wonder, would they do that with anything they were told if it was told to them on a screen by a person presumably under a position of authority? I mean, would it have mattered? How ridiculous could the orders get? How nonsensical could it be if they said, hey, out of abundance of caution, go outside, spray paint yourself hot green, jump up and down on one foot and sing happy birthday for 10 hours, and then you'll be safe and protected. It'll be good. Like, would they do it? Would I go outside and see people doing that? I don't know. It got to the point where I think probably there would be some people doing it. And by the way, this is the last time I'm going to use this phrase, probably ever again. But if I never hear the phrase abundance of caution, it won't be too soon, because I feel like I will never forget how that phrase was used to justify just more and more irrational stuff until it got to a point of just not making any sense at all. Okay, I remember being ordered to wear a mask coming in the door of a restaurant, only to be sat down at a table right next to that same exact door and being told, I'm allowed to remove it now. I shouldn't even have to say this, okay? But air doesn't care if I'm standing up or sitting down when I breathe it. That's just not how air works. I'm sorry, but I'm 5 feet off the ground. I'm 3 feet off the ground. No difference there when I'm breathing in and out. Not a difference. It's all mixed together, okay?
This ain't exactly the Mississippi. I'm on one side. I'm on the other side.
Does not matter. It doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you even doing? That doesn't make any sense. It's just silly. It's just silly if we're going to actually try to make everyone pretend like that does anything. That is silly. Okay? This is why some people began to say they finally understood how the atrocities of World War II could have been allowed to take place. Because it just, again, hundreds of years of human knowledge got rejected and thrown out the window in a single event. Just hundreds of years of known facts, okay? Thrown just right out the window to do things that made no sense. None. Not common or otherwise, no sense. And here we are now, we're in the aftermath, And I think more and more people are actually realizing that the cause did not ever justify the effect. Then the pandemic mostly ended, but I would say not before society got a pretty good look at itself in the mirror. We all lived through this together, even if we were in different multiverses as it was happening, but we were all there. We all saw this. And a lot of us saw what happens to some of us when they're in a majority group and they're made to feel like they're good and right.
Like, that was like we all got kidnapped and put together on an island, and then all of y'all bastards were like, we should eat them. And we're like, what the fuck? And then now they took us off the island, and we're just looking at you on the ride home like, and you're like, oh, wasn't that crazy?
And others who are not in the majority group are dehumanized as bad because they're not doing what they're told. We've seen that now. We all saw what behavior some people will justify using against their fellow humans, their neighbors, their friends, even their own family members when they're put in a situation like that.
And we're like, you tried to eat us.
I mean, I think this guy just kind of summed it up.
I didn't kick you out of those stores. I didn't ruin your job. I didn't tell you you couldn't come to the family reunion. There ain't nothing to forgive on my side, baby boo. This is a you problem, and we're still talking about it.
So this is what just happened for the past couple of years. They let everyone take a peek behind the incredibly thin veil that covers us, right? A peek at everyone's person, their character, the part they've written for themselves in the stage play we call society. And we saw some people who will stand for exactly what they always did, even in the face of something like a global pandemic, while other people could very easily be transformed into authoritarian monsters by the situation as presented without question. And the thing about society is, whether any of us likes it or not, society is based upon all of us being put into positions of trust, trusting each other with each other's lives all day long. Every single one of us, if you are innocent, unless you're a hermit who's living in a cave by himself in the woods somewhere, completely cut off from society altogether, in which case you're not listening to this video, so that's probably not you, right? So all of us, we are in a position where this is the case. If you drive a car in public where other people are driving 2-ton cars, they can slam into your car, right? If they don't follow the rules of the road, if they don't obey stoplights, if they don't use turn signals, things like that. If you go to a restaurant and buy food that someone else cooked and prepared that you're going to put into your body. If you get on an elevator, right, you're trusting the person who certifies elevators that elevator is going to stay connected to the cable and it's going to go to the floor and drop you there and it's not going to break the cable and slam down, and crash, right? You're trusting that elevator. You're trusting the people that built it. You're trusting the people that certify that it's not going to do that. If you let your kids ride the bus to school, all kinds of things. Every single time you turn a light switch on or a water faucet in your house, you are trusting complete strangers with your life in a way. The list goes on and on and on and on. You could make that list all day. We rely on one another all the time without really thinking about it consciously, how interwoven all of our lives are, even with people that you would consider complete strangers otherwise. It's not something we really think about. We just do it, and we do it every single day. The situation now is something major like this happens, and we're kind of forced to look at everything under a new light, and that includes each other. And in this case, it's kind of like the twitchy bare light bulb dangling on a string in the basement of a serial killer, but hey, we're looking at each other in a new light, right? And it's just, the point is, it's not something you can just unsee, though. The knowing of that and the knowing we all have now, we've all had to kind of take stock of ourselves in one way or another. We've all had to see what was done to each other. We've all had to see what was done to us by systems of this society. We've all had to take a good look at all of this. And that knowing, that seeing, it doesn't simply go away just because they said it's over now or whatever. It's not as bad anymore or whatever it is they're saying these days. It changes. We have all now been acquainted with what's lurking underneath that veil. We know the potential now, some of us. We know the potential for how certain people could behave in that situation. And we also know the potential for how much worse things could have been. That's why we can't go back to the way things were before this. There can't be the old normal because you can't unsee the things you have seen. You can lie to yourself. That's the best you can do, is try to pretend like you didn't see it and then lie to yourself about what you saw. I mean, you could disillusion yourself, but you can't really unsee it and unknow it, not deep down. Definitely not in the subconscious parts of yourself and the unconscious parts. Like, it's there. You know, this happened. But it also makes sense that something like that would happen before a massive paradigm shift. A test. And it's a reminder, I think, that the way things are can be changed in a moment. And that is how things have happened in society since time immemorial. Paradigms shift, they change, they shift, and they can be changed in a moment depending on major events and things that happen. Society is not set in stone. It is shifting sands at best. It's a rug that can be pulled out and replaced altogether at any time. And we forget that because we get so into our day-to-day and everything. We forget that this is all just a bunch of agreements that we've all made to do things the way they are. But if that changes, it'll be done some other way. And it has changed in major, major ways throughout time. I mean, one paradigm shift hadn't happened with the American Revolution, I wouldn't be sitting here right now in Texas. I don't know what this place would be called right now, but it wouldn't be Texas. So that's just one example, but this is a reminder of that. And it's also a reminder that we're all people. We're all people. The person, right? There's a persona a human being chooses to play in society. That's the person. And there's a human being underneath that. And that person, it's a viewmaster through which the individual perceives the world. And so the question for each of us is, who is at the helm of that? Who is controlling that program? Is it the human being underneath the person? Or is it some outside force? I mean, are you, in Plato's allegory of the cave, are you in the cave, chained in there, telling yourself the shadows being projected on the wall are real, trying to really make yourself believe the shadows being projected on the wall are real, unwilling to turn around, ask questions, see if there's something else to it? And I don't know, that's a question some people might want to ask themselves. It might also be a question some people are running away from having to ask themselves, because the question itself is too substantial and the answers are maybe too frightening to really ponder. Actually, oddly enough, it was Wizard of Oz that came into my head when I thought about making this video. And I hope I'm not spoiling the movie for everyone, although it came out in 1939, so I doubt it. But if you haven't seen Wizard of Oz from 1939, probably going to spoil it for you now a little bit. But at the beginning, you have a girl named Dorothy who is dealing with a bitter, elitist old lady who Dorothy's Auntie Em says owns half the county, and who could apparently only derive joy from life by concocting reasons to kidnap and murder a little girl's dog and feed off her tears like a witch. And as soon as Dorothy realizes that the society she's in is not just in this regard, but it's injustice that is tipped in the favor of the aforementioned bitter elitist old witch lady who owns half the county, Dorothy runs away from home. And she doesn't get very far at all. She gets right down the street, just a little ways, and runs into a snake oil salesman who's as fake as a $3 bill, who's just waiting outside of her social boundary there. I think he claims to be a mystic or something. And he's just waiting right there to capitalize on Dorothy's newfound fear and confusion at the realization that the world isn't actually what she thought it was, and then manipulate her into going back. But a tornado hits before Dorothy gets back, and she's swept away to a magical land called Oz, where she goes on an adventure to try and find her way home. And in that, she's aided by a scarecrow who thinks he has no brain, a tin man who feels he has no heart, and a lion who thinks that running away from something means he lacks courage. And all of them are under this shared belief that if they just make it to an even more magical place in Oz called the Emerald City, that a wizard there can give each of them what they're seeking. And they have to fight a wicked witch the whole way there. That's the basic plot. And I know the book had to do with the gold standard and all that, but the movie, they've overlaid the movie with a whole other message about something much more deep and personal. And a large portion of this is about the nature of social constructs altogether. You have some people who, and it's especially people who have not really taken the time to get to know themselves. There are some people in that who can fully give themselves over to the belief that there has to be an almighty wizard behind a curtain somewhere who's so great and powerful that he pulls all the switches and he can give them things like courage or brains or heart. People who really truly do believe that a fancy medal on a ribbon or a trinket on a string or a piece of paper bestows upon them something that they could not see or recognize they already had within themselves the whole time. I mean, the audience has shown again and again throughout this movie that the Scarecrow is already smart, and the Tin Man already had a big heart, and the Lion was already courageous because he fought to save Dorothy from the Wicked Witch and protect her the whole time he was doing that. So they already had the things that they were seeking within themselves the whole time. They didn't need a wizard to give it to them. But the ultimate point of this movie, the way this movie ends, has to do with the fact that Dorothy has grown past these childish illusions of what things are. She can't go home again the same way she left it. She can't unsee the injustice. She can't unknow that there's a guy behind the curtain who's pushing buttons and pulling switches and pretending to be an almighty wizard, when in actuality he's just some guy. He's cloaked in an authority, but is it legitimate? She can't go back to not knowing that stuff. She can't go back to the place she thought was home. Because once her eyes were open and she saw the truth, she realized that that place never existed in the first place. And I don't know who needed to hear that today, but there you go. I love you guys. Talk to you soon.